Go live to Barbara Heineback, former advisor to President Clinton. Barbara, great to have you on the program this morning. Such a terrible story.
It's horrible. And why did it take 4 days before they even charged him? And now apparently it's only murder 3. And that is not going to do anything to help and allow the community to become restful. I think it's going to exacerbate people for a while. At least some of the neighboring cities to Minneapolis have now put on a curfew for tonight. And I think we'll see that continue throughout. And it's sad that they had to allow some air to come out of the bubble, let the bubble burst, so to speak, because there was just there was so much anger and hurt and pain. And the saddest thing of all, this is something that started as a peaceful demonstration. And that made all the sense in the world. But then when you got Antifa and you got Black Lives Matter and just people who came in to the city, they were angry just to be angry, cause trouble. And worst of all, they're destroying their own communities.
Now, we saw what happened with Rodney King. That's almost 30 years ago. And I think a lot of people looking outside in thought that things had improved over those 3 decades. What are your thoughts as someone who's worked in federal politics, as an African-American woman yourself?
Yeah, well, I was First Lady's press officer in the White House. And prior to that, I had marched while I was at Howard University to get Martin Luther King Day, for that to become a national holiday. So we were demonstrating for something not just peaceful, but it had a cause and a purpose. So much of what takes place today, even though some things begin as a good opportunity, they turn sour by those who just come in to steal, destroy, and just do damage to their own communities. Back in the 70s, throughout most of the 80s, so many improvements were being made for about 30 years. But now the needle and the pendulum has swung backward. I marched in Washington, D.C. My brother marched in North Carolina for people to ride on the buses and everything that happened just before Rosa Parks. My grandmother was involved with Martin Luther King Jr. when he came through Georgia, in Leesburg, Georgia. People would not allow them to stay in any of the hotels or motels. And my grandmother said, they can come through here and they can stay on our farm, because my grandparents had a farm in Georgia. I grew up in New York. So I've seen peaceful opportunities. I've seen great strides in terms of people getting jobs, education improvements. But now when I look at the country, it's so sad. And I think it's going to take the opposing sides to come together and agree to try to work toward change, come up with a plan on the local and statewide levels. It's a national problem, yes, but it has to be solved, I believe, at the local level, number one, by agreeing and a willingness to bring change and have a plan. And number two, and just as important, the punishment must fit the crime. And too many police have gotten away with too much for too long, and that does not help to bring about a peaceful resolve.
Yeah, well, let's talk about police brutality, because one former officer is now on murder, manslaughter charges. 3 others have been stood down.
I don't think murder 3 is enough. And it's not going to bring about a peaceful resolution, I don't believe. I think it has something in there. I'm not an attorney and law is not my background. But murder 3, I believe, means that it was unintentional. And when you have your knee on someone's neck for 8 minutes, I call that intentional. This man's knee was a lethal weapon. And there were 4 peoples, the energy of 4 that were in that knee. It was the man who had his knee in his neck, and it was the other 3 who stood back peacefully. When you start to really charge someone, I hope he's not just going to be fired and he gets off with a full, his full benefits and retirement. If you strip this man of his entire retirement, he's going to feel the pinch. take away at least 50% of the retirement and all benefits from the other three. When you reach into a person's pocket, they start to pay attention and follow the rules. You cannot expect a nation or a people to change overnight emotionally. And I'm not expecting or asking for people to hold hands and let's just all sing Kumbaya. That's not going to change anything or fix the problem. We've got to start being honest, talking about the real problems, not tap dance around it, trying to be politically correct and work from that perspective.
Barbara, look, it's politics by social media in many ways, the world we're living in, and Donald Trump uses social media all the time. What do you make of this tweet saying when the looting starts, the shooting starts? There was even a disclaimer put by the organisation.
I think it was the wrong thing to be said. Absolutely, no question about that. And when you're tweeting, you have it at your fingertips and you put your mouth in motion before you put your brain in motion, you're going to stumble sooner or later. So as the president, there are so many times when I wish he would just put a cork in it. And it's sad because he's done a lot of good, I mean, more than anything else with the economy in America. But then he turns around and he tweets about something silly, or instead of allowing people who are involved in the problem to have an opportunity to fix and resolve the problem, and he gets in the middle of things too quickly, that does not help the cause at all.
What about what's happening with China at the moment and Hong Kong? I know there's so much happening. We could almost have an American bulletin this morning and basically pulling funding from the WHO.
It's a touch and go situation, and that is something that I think has the world on pins and needles. Wait and see. It's very clear that not just the United States, many countries in Europe and Australia, of course, we want a response about COVID-19 from China. It's time that they start giving us some answers. And how much have they already swept under the rug? To what degree will we ever be able to really get to the truth? I don't know. When it comes to war with China, my thoughts on that are, I think China knows that they cannot win a military war against us. But China, communist China, is very brilliant. She knows what he's doing, and you can hurt people in other ways. And now that so many of us are looking at the lack of manufacturing that we didn't have. I mean, we didn't even have any penicillin made in America, or very, very, very little. And so much that's been made overseas, that's another kind of warfare that, starts to cut you off at your ankles and at your knees rather than going for the bullet right in the heart.
What about your family and friends? You've got many in the United States. How have they coped through the pandemic? I've got friends I've spoken to as well. People in Australia don't quite conceptualise how difficult it has been in many parts of America.
Yeah. Well, I was born and grew up in New York. I was born in Manhattan, grew up on Long Island. Most of my friends and family have moved away and they've been spared and very blessed. However, I have another dear friend who lost 3 to COVID-19, and it was 2 women in their 40s and a man in his young 50s. I believe he was 53. And I was on the phone with her for an hour and a half, and you try to hug through the phone. And she was so tearful and so wrought with pain. She said that her friend was perfectly healthy, no issues, caught COVID-19, went into the hospital. 8 days later, she was dead. Her mother could not ever come and visit her because her mother was elderly. And the hospital that her daughter died in, the mother said her daughter was behind the hospital in a refrigerated truck, in a zip bag, in a lock bag, among many, many other dead bodies. So her mother may never know where her daughter is buried. And that's very tough to get your head around.
Absolutely. And the fact that the Black and Hispanic community of New York has been so severely hit, it highlights the lack of a good medical system in the United States.
It absolutely does, Tim. The pain and the agony there. One of the things that disturbs me greatly is we hear about these cases, we hear about situations of the underserved communities, whether it's in health, in education, in economics, in job disparity. But why is it we only hear about them once every 4 years? I do not like seeing it used as a political ploy and having Black Americans become the pawn of the political game when all of a sudden the mayor of New York or someone else starts to sound so concerned. This didn't just begin yesterday, it's been going on for many a decade. Let's be honest, over a century.
Finally, and I will let you go, and it's been so good to have you on our program this morning. Hopefully we'll talk again over the next few months. But
Yeah,
there
thanks
is
for having me.
there is an election going on, can you believe it? Somewhere in the midst of all of this,
No!
washing away, usually
Tell me.
usually it'd be the top of every news story. But we're only a few months from November. Look,
Yeah.
what do you think?
Um, Uncle Joe, I actually wanted him to be president some 20, 25 years ago. But poor Uncle Joe, he just can't get a sentence out without stumbling over himself. He is, I think, what we're looking at and where the real question of this election is who will he select as vice president? Because that's who we're looking toward as the next president. Whether the Democrats are going to pull a rabbit out of a hat and do a switcheroony on us at the Democratic National Convention come July, we'll see. I don't know what plan is there, and I couldn't begin to guess, but should Joe Biden become the president of the United States, I suspect he'll be stepping down within the first month or first months and say, well, I want a little time with my family, and I've come to realize that I'm having some health issues. Duh.
Yeah, it's a very interesting time. I suppose when the dust finally settles, we'll start to look at the election a lot closer. Barbara, enjoy your weekend. Thank you so much for coming on Weekend Edition.
Thank you for having me, and have a good weekend yourself.